What makes a good adaptation? Wishing to see your favorite book or story being translated to the big screen isn't an unusual wish, and transforming a piece of work into a movie has been proven to be an extremely successful endeavor. But what differentiates the good adaptations from the bad ones? Is it just a matter of keeping things as similar to the original source as possible, or should you embrace the change and try to give the story a completely new look? Is it more about preserving the spirit of the original or fully embracing the challenges and opportunities of the new medium? Is it better to take a risk and be considered memorable, even if it is for the wrong reasons, or should you play it safe and be mostly forgotten? I don't think there's a perfect answer to this question. Your mileage may vary depending on the original source material and the goals of the company or filmmaker behind the final product. However, there are certain things that the public has come to expect out of an adaptation. Generally speaking, people want the original work to still be recognizable. If you are making a movie based on a specific story, keeping the original message of the work, as well as the most iconic lines and characters intact, tends to yield good results. However, certain changes still have to be made in order to make the story translate comfortably to the big screen. This has been a very basic generalization of the issues that plague this debate, and I'm not here to present a concrete solution either. I have seen adaptations that work wonderfully, just as I have come across some that didn't work at all, as well as a few that were so terribly bland that they barely left an impression. And then there's the 2015 movie adaptation of The Little Prince. This book is a tough one to adapt. Its success is unquestionable, having been translated to over 200 languages, so it's safe to assume that it would be a very popular subject matter. However, the narrative itself isn't structured in the way that would be expected of a blockbuster, so you either give it some arbitrary high-stakes plot, or you maintain the original thread and hope that the public has an open mind. However, what the 2015 movie decided to do was follow a different route altogether, and the final result caught me completely off guard. How could this adaptation have caused such a reaction? That's what we're here to discuss. I wanna talk about The Little Prince. The Little Prince is a French book by Antoine de Saint-Exupéry, published sometime around the end of World War II. The tale is told from the perspective of an aviator who crashes into the desert and meets a little prince, who has journeyed across the universe and is now planning to return home. The prince began his story on a small planet, which Earthlings perceive to be an asteroid. Back home, his life was defined by cleaning the land of baobabs, which start off as small bushes but can grow into destructive trees if not eliminated. He also had a fondness for sunsets, being able to watch as many of them as he liked by simply walking around the planet, which he did especially when he was sad. Another thing he was fond of was a rose, who demanded special care and attention. One day, the prince decides to leave his planet, taking flight with a flock of birds. Throughout space, he stops by several other asteroids, each inhabited by a strange man. The first planet is taken by a grown-up who claims to be king, but he only makes orders when conditions are favorable. For instance, when the prince asks to see a sunset, the king tells him to wait until the evening so that he can order the sun to set. In the next planet lives a conceited man who asks people to applaud him and then relishes on that meaningless praise. He meets a man struggling with an alcohol addiction, and then a businessman who spends his days counting every star in the universe, saying that because he has found them first, he therefore gets to own them. The following planet is occupied by a lamplighter who has to light up a street lamp and put it out once every minute, because the rules demand that he does so. Except the rules had been written a long time ago, and with the years the planet began spinning faster and faster, but the rules were never changed to accommodate for that. On the very last asteroid, the prince meets a geographer who is only interested in recording what is eternal, and he recommends that the prince visit Earth next. On each stop, the prince tries to understand these men and their lives, but he always comes out short-handed. The adults seem unwilling to reason with him, and when they do offer an explanation to their behavior, it's just as empty and confusing. The whole voyage is permeated by an idea of loneliness. The men in the planets have no real connections, existing solely for themselves, and the prince is unable to form any sort of bond with them. When the boy lands on Earth, some of the most memorable characters he meets are a snake, who says it can help the prince reach the end of his journey, and over 100 roses, making the prince realize that his rose is just an ordinary plant, and not a unique flower like she had had him believe. He then runs into a fox, who shares some philosophies on the idea of taming. To tame someone is to establish ties. That person then becomes unique to you, and vice versa. Taming demands work and patience, and it makes being apart from them really painful, but it also allows you to see the world differently. For example, the fox compares the color of the wheat fields to that of the prince's hair, and says that once they have been tamed, they will feel immense happiness when looking at an otherwise meaningless field, because it will now remind them of their dear friend. By that logic, even though the princess rose was a common flower, she became special because of the time she and the boy spent together. At last, the prince meets the Aviator, who very slowly figures out the details of the boy's journey. They end up bonding as the man fixes up his plane, and he is distraught to find out that the prince plans to leave this planet with the help of the snake, which is to say, through deadly venom. The prince says that even though their departure will be arduous, the Aviator is now blessed with the ability to see the world differently. For instance, when he looks at the stars, he will think of his friend, and they will all seem to be laughing. In the end, the prince gets bitten, and the Aviator tasks the reader with looking up at the sky and seeing what the prince's life is like now that he has returned home. The Little Prince is classified as a children's book. The author himself called it such, and the very narrative constantly calls back to the idea that grown-ups are incapable of understanding the true depth of that story. I'll admit I didn't really like the book as a kid. I was only able to finish it as a teenager, being too discouraged by its tone before. It's a story that isn't so much focused on structure and plot as it is on poetry and meaning. The point isn't what happens, but the ideas that are shared as the events unfold. There's a deep sense of melancholy that sticks through every page, especially with how there is a great deal of loss involved. Although the book argues that loving someone is worth it because it fundamentally changes your worldview, it doesn't downplay the pain of losing someone. The very question posed by the narrator at the end dares us to reflect on the subject. The reader must choose between imagining a future where the prince and his rose were reunited, or one where the rose didn't make it. It isn't presenting an easy solution when it comes to grief, but instead an invitation to use the story to help you cope with whatever outcome might be true to you. And this both is and isn't the story of the 2015 The Little Prince movie. The film follows a 9-year-old girl who is trying to be accepted into a prestigious academy. Even though she is very clever and hardworking, she fails to answer the last question of the admission interview: what will you be when you grow up? Because of this, she moves with her mother into the academy's neighborhood and studies even harder throughout her summer vacation in the hopes of getting a second chance. On the house next door lives an old man, who every now and then sends her pages of a story he's been working on. The girl is skeptical at first, but eventually gives in to the narrative and asks the old man to keep telling it. This story turns out to be The Little Prince, with the old man supposedly being the Aviator who met the boy a long time ago. The girl begins neglecting her studies in favor of spending time with the old man, who is a little bit eccentric but overall a good influence. He exists in direct opposition to the other grown-ups in town. While they reside in grey houses and live calculated lives, the old man lives among colorful collections and machines and follows a playful and carefree lifestyle. From this basic outlook, it wouldn't be hard to guess where this movie is trying to take us. The girl must learn that it's okay to let loose and have fun, and that getting into that academy would be following her mother's plans for her instead of choosing her own destiny. The Book of the Little Prince places great importance on the idea of connections, and it is that story that brings the two neighbors closer. But that is not where this movement stops. The story of the book isn't presented all at once, but instead slowly developed through gorgeous stop-motion scenes as the girl reads it page by page according to what the old man had written thus far. It isn't long until we reach the part where the prince visits the nearby asteroids, coming into full contact with how the world of adults seemed confusing and pointless. As the girl reminisces over those pages, she watches her mother fuss over the checklist board she had created to control her daughter's studies, and she imagines the lady as the inhabitant of her own little planet, a land covered in points to be ticked off, with markers that have lost all meaning. She is using the story of the little prince to make sense of her own life. That moment right there is when this movie goes beyond a mere adaptation. But we'll get into that soon enough. The girl had already questioned the purpose of her study slightly, but now she fully takes the leap, spending as much time as she can with her new friend. The prince's story seems to be interwoven with her own. As the boy learns about the art of taming with the fox, the girl strengthens her connection with the old man. However, life doesn't seem to be on their side, as an unfortunate car accident ends up severing their connection, with the little girl being forced to go back to her studies and the old man distancing himself from her in order to avoid more trouble. She tries to get him to finish the story, but she is extremely dissatisfied with its open ending, imagining a future in which the little prince never made it back to his home planet and was forced to become just another mindless adult. There's clearly a level of self-projection here, and the old man tries to dissuade her from it, but she won't listen. She rejects the story and her friend altogether, storming out the door. Things are looking pretty bleak by now, but don't worry, they get worse. The old man's health had been deteriorating over time, and it looks like his body is on the brink of giving out, forcing the little girl to deal with the possibility of his passing. She convinces herself that the only way of saving her friend is by fixing the little prince's story, which means she must rescue the boy from the future she has created and help him find his way back home so that he can finally be with his Rose. What we are seeing is an example on how to interpret the little prince's story, and how it can be used by someone to make sense of the world they live in. The girl manages to find the little prince, now a grown-up who has lost his way and has forgotten all about his adventures. He is an outcast, desperately trying to fit in, but failing at every turn. The world he inhabits is ruled by the strange adults he has met on the other asteroids, with the businessman standing as the biggest boss of all. I gotta say, making the last third of your movie a self-insert dream sequence where you age up the main character of your source material and place him in a gritty remake of his own universe is a bold move. But it works. So much thought went into the section that it's impossible not to investigate all of its little details. This planet is the culmination of nearly every troubling real-life aspect that the little girl was trying to come to terms with. The biggest company on this land specializes in turning childhood objects into paperclips, which the grown-ups deem essential. This idea echoes the question the girl failed to answer during the interview at the beginning, because the correct response was looming over her the entire time. When asked what she would be when she grew up, the girl was supposed to say, essential. sacrificing all innocence and freedom in the name of productivity. It is those same paper clips that are used to pick the locks that trap her, implying that childhood is never truly destroyed. Because even when your spirit is stripped down of all light, there is still a way of salvaging it and giving it a new purpose. The stars, which symbolized connection and joy, have been stolen from this future and trapped into a glass dome, a throwback to when the girl herself vacuumed up the stars off her ceiling after rejecting the old man's story. The shape of the dome is also relevant, since it echoes the one seen in her snow globe collection. Those same items were a gift from her absent father, who left the family in order to dedicate more time to his career. Existing in the name of your job ruins your bonds and the love that once forged them, and it enslaves the very ideas of happiness and freedom. When the girl rescues the prince and returns him to his asteroid, they realize the land has been overtaken by vicious trees, and that the rose herself has wilted away. Amidst the pain of losing her, the prince finds solace in how the sunrise will always remind him of her, and with that, he abandons his grown-up form and returns to his true self. The prince's new journey was both a rejection of the business-driven world of adulthood and the process of accepting the loss of his greatest loved one. Even though that pain will always live within him, knowing the rose changed him as a person, and he will carry that gift with him until the end of time. Because that's what the girl had been struggling to do regarding the old man. When the girl finished hearing the story, she didn't get it at first. She found its ending too sad and the lack of an answer discouraging. Part of that rejection came from her own reluctance to see the similarities between that tale and her own existence. When she was forced to confront the reality of loss and grief, she couldn't bear it. Her journey to rescue the little prince from a hopeless world represents her own process of not only understanding his story, but also of finding a way to use its message to carry her forward and help her through a difficult time. This is a movie about the little prince and about the act of reading The Little Prince. When she returns from her journey, she makes peace with the old man's departure, visiting him at the hospital, knowing this could be their final encounter. The movie ends with a shot of her stargazing with her mother, fixing the rift between them that had plagued them for the entire film, staring at a sky that is essentially the same to all humans, but fundamentally unique to the little girl, because of the time she had spent with her friend. I can't say I love everything about this movie. There are some choices made here that don't necessarily agree with my personal tastes. The prince only meets 3 of the men in the asteroids, them being the king, the conceited man, and the businessman. Other planets are referenced through the visuals, but not really explored. This was a little disappointing to me since the lamplighter was my favorite of the planets, basically because it was the metaphor I had the best grasp of when I finished the book at 13, and I was looking forward to seeing it in this adaptation. The film also chooses to show a version of the Little Prince in the same 3D style that is used for the little girl, and it's a vastly inferior version to the stop-motion one. Because they wanted the little girl's journey to more closely mirror the parts of the book, they ended up rushing through a few of them in order to get to the fox, and I would have liked to see them too. But those choices were made for a reason, even if they're not personally appealing to me. Every adaptation has to cut certain things out from the source material, and they decided to streamline the asteroid sequence. Even the other parts that were cut are still implied to exist within the book she's reading. It's just that the movie is focusing on what the girl found most relevant, so of course she would linger over the parts that echoed more true to her life. The act of showing the 3D prints instead of the stop-motion one at the end is also perfectly understandable. This is her version of the character, spawned from her own personal interpretation, and thus it follows the same style that represents her existence. I didn't even touch upon all aspects of this adaptation. There's still a lot that can be said about the nature of the girl's relationship with her parents, or the questionable purpose of an education system that exists just to prepare students for the workforce, and how it can be fought with the power of literature and critical thinking. I didn't even scratch the surface when it comes to the themes and morals of the Little Prince book. But much like the little girl focused on some details instead of others, I too am limiting my interpretation to what jumps out as most relevant to me, and this bias is impossible to eliminate when reading any body of work. My ideas do not limit the totality of lessons that can be derived from this, much like the girl's interpretation of the story isn't declared to be the only correct possibility. This movie is not only a really solid adaptation, but a truly transformative piece of work. Much like the original book, it presents ideas of love, loss, connections, and grief with fantastic grace and poetry, and it shamelessly invites you to come along. It captures the spirit of the original and brings it a new light, creating a captivating masterpiece that is sure to win your heart. Thank you for watching. Well, hello there. It was very nice of you to watch this video. Special thanks to my beautiful patrons for making videos like these possible. You guys are my dear red roses. If you would like to join the gang, click the link in the description. If you have enjoyed the video, you can also help me out by clicking the like button, subscribing to the channel, and clicking the notification bell too. You can also follow me on Twitter and share this video with your friends. Feel free to leave a comment down below, especially if it is about how much you love The Little Prince. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on my next video. Bye! I feel very represented by this movie because when this 9-year-old girl finishes reading the first part of The Little Prince, she is like,
I found it quite odd.
Girl, same!